Welcome back to the Madison Advisory AI Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Verner Thompson, founder of Madison Advisory AI. This show sits at the intersection of leadership, judgment, and technology because while AI and automation are accelerating decisions everywhere, thoughtful human systems still determine whether those decisions actually create value. Today's conversation gets into the heart of that tension. I'm joined by Kristin Tugman, an industrial organizational psychologist and longtime leader in disability and workforce strategy. Most people think disability is a benefit or a claim. Kristin sees it differently as a workforce system that sits at the intersection of healthcare, cost, productivity, psychological safety, and leadership. In this episode, we will talk about what employers misunderstand most about disability, why the middle bucket of employees matters more than anyone realizes, and how leaders can protect both people and performance. Kristin, I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to have this conversation.
Just to get started, what do you think employers most misunderstand about disability and absence today?
Yeah, I think disability, it's sort of the age old discussion around healthcare costs versus ancillary benefits. And a lot of times ancillary benefits get lost in the crisis that is healthcare. And frankly, we've been in a healthcare crisis for a really long time. Healthcare costs have been, as we all know, rising unsustainably for years and years. But what employers often miss, and I think they're getting there, but they often miss the fact that disability claimants account for the bulk of their healthcare costs. And so it makes sense, right? So if you're out on disability, you are experiencing a condition or an injury that is requiring you to go to the doctor more often. And the nature of disability requires us to go to the doctor at a rate in which is sort of a cadence that most of us aren't used to, but it requires us to defend why it is that we're disabled. And as a result of that, it requires using more and more healthcare. So the longer somebody's out, the more healthcare benefits they're going to use, and the more that they're going to cost their employer. And then ultimately, we know, the intersection there is that disability claims drive healthcare costs, but they also drive productivity loss, right?
Right.
Because certainly employees. We don't have employees sitting around in our workplaces that we don't need. And so when somebody's out, we experience a significant gap. And as a result, there's immediate productivity loss, but then there's also the gap that exists with employees having to cover for that individual. So while we don't have extra employees, then we've got employees who are having to cover extra work that ultimately then can lead to additional healthcare cost because we're overworked, not taking care of ourselves, and ultimately those folks I actually did a study with Aflac, actually. It's out there publicly when I was with Prudential, where we looked at the impact to employees left behind that are left behind to cover for an employee who's out of work. And folks experienced at pretty significant rate, I think it was somewhere in the high 20%, was folks experienced either an exacerbation of their current condition or experienced a new condition, be it either mental health or a new chronic condition. So all of it is undeniably intertwined. And
Right.
so if we're not addressing productivity, health proactively, but also addressing the disability world and disability management when somebody should have to go out on, unfortunately, an unpredicted illness or injury, we're just exacerbating the entire sort of snowballed cycle that is health and disability.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd never really thought about that extra layer of the impact on those employees left behind, if you will. And that makes sense because it is an entire another level of stress and responsibility. And
Exactly.
I think this really speaks to my next question, given all the components you just discussed. But you also talk about disability as part of a system and not just a line item. What do you mean about that?
So when I think about just psychological safety and creating a work environment that really propels productivity, we've really got to think about it. I think about it in sort of four pillars, sort of, that ultimately lead us to one, trying to preserve productivity and minimize absence and minimize disability claims. But I think when we think about, again, psychological safety, employer culture, we do miss this whole notion around leave and absence and disability in that conversation, I think, all too often. And we've got to tie them together. And so when I think about all of it, it really starts from the beginning. So creating an employer environment that is psychologically safe, that has policies and practices and benefits and resources that meet employees where they are within that particular population. So understanding the age of your population. What we're in a multi-generational workforce, and we've been saying this for years, but we're in a
Yeah.
multi-generational workforce like we've not experienced, and that continues. And so you have to understand the makeup of your workforce. What do people need, and what are they striving for? Do you have folks that are trying to retire, and are they ill prepared to retire? Do you have a new generation coming in that's really looking for career growth and mentorship? So at the at the root of it is understanding the nature of your workforce and then creating benefits and policies and practices that support them. And so ultimately what that does then is it allows employees to feel empowered to do what they need to care for their well-being and their health. And so ultimately if we have that foundation, then you're going to have less disability claims. But then as we move through the spectrum, you're always going to have situations where people experience unexpected illness or injury. And so we've got to be able to have a culture that allows for things like accommodation and stay at work. So managers then have to be equipped to understand and recognize when somebody has potentially an emerging disabling condition or an emerging challenge, and be empathetic enough to recognize it and have the tools in their tool belt to be able to have a conversation to say, oh geez, I noticed you might be struggling, what can I do to help? And then on top of that, if there's something that we can do to prevent a claim, or prevent somebody having to go out, even if it's from, I think it's important to think about it from even an intermittent leave perspective, right? So there's so many more caregivers in the workforce today. So it doesn't matter why you might need leave or an absence. What can we do to help support you so that you can remain productive? Is it supporting you as a caregiver? Is it supporting you as you deal with a mental health challenge? Is it supporting you as you deal with um, one of your children maybe experiencing a mental health challenge? And so then there's stay at work opportunity, and then we're always going to have people that need to take a leave, unfortunately. Or fortunately, maybe it's a maternity leave, and we really want to create again that culture that stays connected to employees, and managers know what to do. How do I stay connected? How do I say the right thing? What do I say? What do I not say? How do I ensure that I communicate with my employee how to navigate being out, and what their responsibilities are and what it's going to be like when they return? And so that gets us to that fourth bucket, which is return to work. And how do we then take it all the way through to engaging with employees when they're ready to return, helping them understand what it's going to be like on day one when they return? Because the key here is helping employees feel prepared for their return. It's not as much how they will return or when they will return.
Yeah.
It's how prepared am I to return? How do I know that I'm going to be welcomed when I get back to work? How do I know that I'm going to be able to be given the tools that I need to be successful? Because we know the longer somebody's out, the more anxiety creeps in, and they feel like, geez, do I even remember how I used to do that particular task? And so it's this whole spectrum then that is sort of, I think about it in a circle, right? So um, somebody comes back to work, and then we engage them back into that whole world of psychological safety and ensuring that they have the resources and feel empowered to, again, maintain their well-being and mental health and physical health. And so it's that whole spectrum
It's a
right.
lot more nuanced than one realizes when you just talk about disability or absence and return to work. There all of the different layers that you've walked through. And I love that you spoke to being empowered. You don't always think about having an empowered employee when you're speaking about a disability, but it does all tie in together. How do healthcare costs and disability claims actually interact in practice?
Well, I think so when we think about healthcare, right, we're always trying to identify the high cost claimant, right? I mean, healthcare costs, it's again unsustainable, and anybody that knows anything about insurance, right, it's all about spreading the risk, and so we're only going to get worse as we think about how the ACA subsidies have been suspended. I would say maybe they'll be reinstated, but there's also in 2026 people that are going to fall off Medicaid, and so as you limit that risk pool and costs, so it's going to impact all of us. So costs will continue to go up, and so as a result of that, and what we've already seen with high deductible health plans, that was obviously a cost containment craze for over the last 15 years. They didn't turn out as well as we would like because people just felt like, and will continue to feel like, as we see costs continue to rise, um, that they don't have health care because they have a high deductible. And so it's hard to meet that deductible if you're going in for routine care. And so we experience delayed care or reduced access to care. And so the longer we wait for care, the more likely we are to have a significant condition that could lead us to becoming a high cost claimant. But also those folks that are experiencing delayed care in an acute situation, or one that becomes chronically chronic, will become disabling potentially. And so not only do you have somebody who is leaning on your health care and driving costs, but they're going to lean on your absence and disability program as well. And then you're going to have that gap in productivity because that employee is going to be absent. Then you're going to have to cover for them. I mean, so that's really what we're trying to prevent is, how do we help people stay proactively healthy and use the healthcare system for what we know can be most beneficial, which is preventive care, and get people to a place where they don't necessarily need disability. I actually was looking at data of a really large customer for a potential project recently, and what I found was that when we talk about preventive care, people aren't getting it. And so, like, just even with mental health, a very small percentage of the folks that within this particular organization were seen prior to going out on disability. So basically what you have happening, right, is your folks who are just struggling, struggling, struggling until they basically can't get out of bed and go to work the next day. And we didn't know about them until they're ultimately gonna spend a decent amount in healthcare costs, but also they're gonna end up on disability. So those 2 things are so intertwined that we've gotta and then when you look at your disability population from a data perspective, it really gives you the opportunity to hone in on where do we wanna implement programs, where do we wanna implement point solutions that are more preventative. It helps us pinpoint where are people struggling and how do we want to engage them in a way that is ultimately gonna get them to a place of where they wanna be, which is healthy and productive back at work.
Right. And a lot of employers have really focused on preventative care. I love the point that you made about preventative mental health care. Haven't seen that as often. I don't think that's really widespread amongst employer encouragement or employees understanding that that's perhaps available,
Yeah.
to start honing in on that before it becomes more of a disability.
I feel
Uh,
like if we actually could equate mental and physical health, we'd be in a much better space in terms of, like, we're encouraged to get a physical every year. Why not have a mental health checkup every year? Or
yeah.
treat mental and physical health the same. Like, I might get up, like, you can hear my voice a little raspy. I don't always sound like this, right? I've had a bit of a cold. And so I slept extra, took care of myself, always had extra water around. Do we do that for our mental health? Right? Because we all have mental health every single day, just like we all have physical health every single day. And I think too often we lose sight of that. And so we don't take care of our mental health until it gets to a point where the anxiety or the depression is so acute that we're not functional. Whereas just because your mental health is slightly off doesn't mean you have a condition, just means that we need to be a little more mindful and focus a little bit more on self-care. just like I would when I have a cold, right?
Very true. And even the impact of decline in mental health care impacts your physical health care too. So they definitely coincide as well. And I
Absolutely.
do think as a society we leave out one entire bucket often,
We sure
more
do.
often than
Sure
not.
do.
um, if an employer wanted one early sign that something is breaking, especially in that example you just gave, the employees going out on mental health leave, but there was no sign until it occurred, what would you tell them to watch?
If I'm looking at data, I'm looking at, I think one of the telltale signs is unscheduled absence. And that tells us that folks are dealing with, there's likely some sort of policy or practice that's driving behavior because folks are feeling like they can't manage their lives. And so they're using some of their regulated benefit to manage their schedule, or they're having to, they've got some caregiving obligations, and they're not feeling like they can communicate that with the employer. And unscheduled absence is what gives managers the most headaches and what creates some of the biggest productivity challenges, and ultimately is rarely dealt with adequately from an existing policy perspective. There's policies and best practices that we routinely put in place, but I think again, the health of an organization is can really be identified through the level of unscheduled absence and how predictable attendance is for the employee population.
In your experience, how many employers track that metric?
Generally they track it. It's just whether or not they know what to do with it.
Okay.
Um, it creates a ton of noise between the HR team and the business, different business units and management. Especially anything that is shift work or call center related tends to have a lot of unscheduled absence, and typically again, there's a policy or a practice that is driving that behavior. And it speaks to the health of the organization. So they'll look at it and just not know what to do about it and not know what's driving it. And feel almost paralyzed in how to manage it, because ultimately it tends to become sort of a contagion within the organization where it just becomes part of the culture. Like, we have a restrictive attendance policy. And by the way, new employee, I've been here for 8 years, and here's how you manage that. Go to the doctor and get yourself an intermittent leave, or get yourself an ADA leave as an accommodation sign off. And so it becomes sort of this contagion throughout the workplace, and is really disruptive and can create this significant us against them mentality that ultimately has a significant detrimental impact to the psychological safety within the organization. And it just creates this notion that everybody's trying to get away with something, and employees feel like managers are trying to be overbearing and don't understand, and it
Right.
creates a really unhealthy toxic environment.
Yeah, and culture can really drive that, as you described. Once it's a learned culture in some instances. When we've spoken, you've described three different populations: the resolvers, permanently disabled, and then the middle bucket. Why is the middle bucket so critical?
Yeah, so in my view, so I've spent most of my research career focused on the psychology of disability and return to work. And so what's interesting about any type of disability, any reason that you have to go out, including maternity leave, and I can speak from experience because I remember my own maternity leave and having done this research, and frankly, having my mom say to me when I was getting ready to go back, what were my fears of return to work? And I remember totally blowing her off and saying, Mom, people have babies every day and go back to work. It's not a big deal. And I was actually at work six weeks in, and my daughter slept through the night at 12 weeks. So you can see the gap. And I was, sick, had a cold because, you're burning the candle at both ends. And I was doing a really routine task, and forgot what I was doing. And I remember thinking to myself, what if this is just too hard? And in that moment, I sort of shook it off because of the research I had done, and I heard my mom's voice going, "Yeah, I told you so," um, and realized that anytime you're attempting to return to work from time away, it's a psychological event. It doesn't have to be diagnosable, but it's a psychological event. And so as a result of that, we all have cognitive barriers or thoughts that come up that make us doubt our ability to return or make us doubt that it's better to return than it is to stay out and receive that disability paycheck. And so in my research, the keys to the kingdom in the disability industry are that middle bucket. And so like you said, there are people who are just going to self-resolve. They're going to have an appendectomy and they're going to do all right and they're going to go back. And so we don't focus our energies there. And then unfortunately, there are people who are just permanently and totally disabled, and we want to do whatever we can to help them get back to a productive life in any way that they can find life satisfaction. But then there's that middle bucket we know should be improving. They're just not. And the way the disability industry works is we don't necessarily have the ability to have all of the nuanced information in objective medical data that allows us to say, geez, you should be back. And so it's nuanced. And so people we talk about return to work dates coming and going often, which creates a lot of headaches for employers and disability insurers because people and doctors don't necessarily talk to folks in a way that helps them recognize the barriers they're experiencing to return to work. And so ultimately, we've got to help people understand that because really the experience I've again done several studies, the experience of disability is all about consequence. And we know consequence, we think of it as negative, but consequences can be positive or negative. And so people have to recognize that the consequence of me staying out of work is greater than the consequence of me returning to work. And then what are all of the factors that play into me making that decision? Is it that I don't know what it's going to be like and I feel like my manager was mad at me when I left anyway, so if I go back, I'm probably going to lose my job. And oh, by the way, I'm getting paid over here to be disabled, and so that's a lot safer. And so we can live in that world for a very long time, believing that I have to continue to defend my impairment and my disability in order to survive, and never underestimate the power of survival instinct. And so we've got to help people understand that, like, a really good example was I did a study actually for my dissertation, and the last person I interviewed, she was just out for bunion surgery. And so I interviewed people that were out of work for at least 45 days and had successfully returned to work. And so I asked her, everybody was generally there's consequences immediately, negative consequences when you go out, like, geez, I don't know how I'm going to support my family. This is part of who I am. I work. It's just a really negative adjustment. And this person, I said, how did it feel when you realized you were going to have to be out? She was like, great. And I thought to myself, oh, geez, might need to throw this one out because this is inconsistent with the rest of the study population. And then as I was talking to her, she was like, oh, yeah, it was great. I got to spend more time with my husband. I got to learn how to cook. I was doing some gardening. I hated it there anyway. And I said, oh, well, what made you decide to return to work? And she basically kind of wanted to say to me, duh, I needed my health care insurance. And so that was
Oh,
what got her to return because she needed her health care. But there's a lot of people that don't think about that. They're just really stuck in this whole, I need my disability income paycheck. And I'm not thinking about what is it going to be like a year from now? What are the consequences a year from now? So if disability case managers can talk to people about, hey, what do you think this is? What are the consequences a year from now? And maybe sometimes they're really concrete, tangible consequences. Or maybe it's just the person is afraid to return to work and afraid that somebody's going to ask them why they were out, that their coworkers are mad at them, that they're not going to perform. Maybe they're 80% and they are under the impression they have to be 100% or they're going to be performance managed. So it's all about making those concerns and fears concrete so that the person again recognizes that it's safe to return to work. And if we just keep treating disability like it's a transactional arrangement or a transactional situation, we're going to continue to have that middle bucket that's going to continue to perpetuate disability costs, contribute to lost productivity, and ultimately contribute to high healthcare costs. We've got to get to that middle bucket and help them overcome their barriers and feel safe and prepared in their return.
Yeah, and it may be so difficult because the middle bucket, it's not as straightforward,
Hmm.
perhaps, as to why they aren't returning to work. You have
Exactly.
tested interventions that reduce the time away from work. What
Hmm.
made them effective?
I do think it's the preparation and the connection. We find that people that feel connected and feel like, again, that it's not this unknown. There's a ton of research out there actually on even just mental health and readmissions to a hospital or um, continued suicidal ideation, for example, where if when somebody is discharged from the hospital, if the hospital just reached out to them once to say, "Hey, I just wanted to see how you're doing, and we care about you," the readmission rate and the recidivism around suicidal ideation was substantially reduced. And so we actually did so something similar, just as along those same lines. We worked with when I was at my previous role. Um, in within a disability insurance company, I worked with this Duke Center for Advanced Hindsight, and I have a cognitive behavioral model that is designed to be sort of a disability management case management model that does involve talking with folks and walking them through exercises and having them overcome barriers. But the idea in this experiment was to gather data from a population of about 1,000 claimants that were out for like orthopedic injuries and mental health over a year period. So we looked at 1,000 folks out for during a 12-week period intervention period, and we took that model and we shortened it basically, and we made it into text prompts and voice messages. So there was three groups: a control group, a text group, and a call group. And just by reaching out via text over a 12-week period and a call group. So it wasn't case management, it was just voicemails or a
Okay.
very, very brief phone call, just connecting with these folks with the cognitive behavioral approach. And then the control group. And that study population, both the call and the text group, their short term disability durations were 7 days shorter than the control group just by connecting and planting seeds in someone's mind about it's okay, we're here for you. Here are some exercises. We'll talk about your 5 fears of return to work. Um, Call your manager. Have you talked to your physician about how they can support you in your effort to return to work? Just planting seeds reduce disability durations by a significant amount. And so we know that this ability to stay connected and help people feel sort of remove this notion around the unknown is really, really effective. The other thing is preparation around things like transitional return to work. So I've worked with a lot of customers over the year, meaning employers, to build transition return to work programs, which is identifying job modifications that are possible in advance of somebody ever going out of work. And so basically it starts to create a culture that expects and supports return to work. We take the guesswork out of return to work planning for all involved, the return to work planner, the physician, the manager, and the employee. And we already know what are the things that in this particular job that we can do to modify the tasks that align with potential restrictions and limitations. And then we can talk to the person about this opportunity proactively when they go out. Talk to them about the fact that we're going to work with them throughout the life of their disability. And when they're ready, we'll place them in a plan that allows them to gradually and incrementally return to work full time, full duty in their regular position. And so it allows them to understand what's going to happen on day one. Here's how I'm going to progress. If I have particular things that are particularly stressful, maybe we can remove those tasks for a very short period of time. But we know incrementally and gradually, it's healthier to return to work over that short period of time. We've seen really significant, depending on how long durations start out to begin with, but we've seen millions of dollars in savings, 20 to 40% reduction in cost with implementing a successful transition return to work program. And what that also does is it prevents claims from going to long-term disability, which has a significant benefit to the employer on healthcare costs, as well as to the employee, because once you're on long-term disability, you often lose you might lose your spot, right? You don't have a job to return to, and you might lose your benefits. And so it really benefits everyone to get somebody back within that short-term disability time period. But things like disability case management, transitional return to work, and just staying connected to employees goes a really long way to improve disability outcomes.
And I would think the transition to work plan would really provide a lot of psychological safety for the employee. So, as there's a
Absolutely.
stepping stone to get back. And we have talked a lot about psychological safety in general. How would you define that in a way that's practical?
Yeah. So when I think about the mental health crisis and psychological safety in general, I think we have to think about a couple things. One, what perpetuates the mental health crisis, I think, is lack of awareness. We still struggle with stigma and lack of access to care. And so we can incorporate that into a psychological safety program within the workplace because we have such a huge opportunity within the workplace to support each other, right? So when you think about work, it's sort of like your second family. Your coworkers know you, your manager knows you, or your manager should know you, and so it gives us the environment opportunity to raise awareness, to understand when somebody might be struggling to the point where there's this mental health challenge or emerging mental health condition, and allows and equips managers with the ability to know what to say, what to do, equips coworkers with the ability to know what to say, to know what to do. And so when you think about the foundation of a psychological safety program, awareness is key, and that starts with um, really mental health sensitivity across the employee population and across the leadership population. So to normalize mental health conversations, and it's okay to bring your whole self to work. It's okay to have mental health every single day. It's okay to actually ask how you're doing and listen, right? And so that actually helps us raise awareness, normalize mental health, reduce stigma, and then there's the whole notion around access to care, which is always um, given me significant concern in the sense that we know that we have a mental health provider shortage. We know that in most areas it can take up to 8 months to get in to see a provider. And so what's important is to sort of analyze access to care, at the very basic level. How many visits does somebody get from an EAP perspective? How many, what is the access to the health plan? What's the deductible? How quickly can you get in to see a provider? But then at the same time, we have to get creative around access to care, and we have to recognize that really where our opportunity is recognizing when somebody has a mental health challenge or is just needs to vent versus gets all the way to the point of needing treatment, right? What do we do today generally from a mental health perspective is we wait for somebody to raise their hand and say they need something. And then we hope that they remember to call the EAP, that we even have an EAP and that they can get in. And so the way we're going to get a handle on it is um, to provide resources that meet people where they are in their mental health journey, because we all have a mental health journey, that allows us to kind of create the skills and the tools that we need to hopefully, for most of us, prevent the need to get have us get to that acute phase and that crisis intervention phase. And then hopefully we'll have those slots available because we're always going to have people who need therapy and we're always going to have people who need crisis intervention. And so if we create that sort of foundation of normalizing mental health in the workplace, we start to create that foundation around psychological safety. And then there is another environment factor that when we think about all of the different sort of components that the APA, I like the APA at 2015 psychological safety framework. I love actually that the Surgeon General came out with a framework in 2024, and I do follow that quite a bit. But I feel like the APA, like it's so simple to rattle off, and it's easy to align the APA's psychological safety framework with the Surgeon General. Um, and I also saw that the psychological safety framework sort of evolved post-COVID as we started to think about what's reasonable around things like development, performance development, and always expecting us to, to want to move on to the next stage of our career. Sometimes it's okay to stay where you are because you got a lot of stuff going on, and that should be safe. So then, so we raise awareness, reduce stigma, improve access to care, and then we've got to create this environment that does allow employees to feel heard and that their feedback is taken seriously, because they know the employees on the front line know what works and what doesn't work. We've got to model balance and work-life balance, right? We during COVID, I mean, the lines between work and life never became more blurred, and we never experienced more burnout. And so it's more important now to make sure that we are modeling as managers, as leaders, balance, and not and trying to understand what are the boundaries that me personally I need to set to prevent burnout, and how do we facilitate that thought process within the rest of the organization. And then development, again, it's always important for folks to feel like they have the opportunity for growth. But again, sometimes it's okay to stay where you are. You don't always, like we always, I hate the whole as an IO psychologist, the raise the bar theory. Because if I was exceptional last year and it about killed me, how overwhelming and daunting is that to think, oh, that wasn't enough. That's not going to be enough for 2026. Well, some years it has to be enough, and you have to just support your employees, right? And so if you can create that sort of framework around raising awareness, reducing stigma, improving access to care, that is a safe environment. And then the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And employers do provide security. They provide financial security. They provide health security. They provide food security. And so if you have a full benefit package that you communicate to your employees, again, that's creating that sense of psychological safety because I know I have a consistent safety net that it are going to take care of my basic needs. And so I think all of it can feel as an employer overwhelming to think about all those different components, but sort of building a project plan around each of them and really understanding where are we today and where do we aspire to go, and putting sort of milestones in place that demonstrate progress. It does make it much more practical, and the ROI is astronomical because today you're going to create significant productivity enhancements, loyalty, and again, we don't have employees at work that we don't need, and so if we can maximize their satisfaction and loyalty, we're going to maximize their engagement, and we're going to maximize their productivity.
Do you think it can be very overwhelming for leaderships and employers to overcome or grasp psychological safety? There are so many different components to it, so I can see that there's a lot to work through there. When it comes to technology and how that can help or hurt employers, how have you seen that in practice? Because I can think off the top of my head, perhaps with the concierge service of an AI bot, perhaps reaching out to people that could be a help.
Sure.
How have you seen it in other ways?
So far in the disability space, I've seen it try to sort of identify particular claims that are most at risk of like moving on to long-term disability. I've seen it identify those that are most appropriate for what the industry calls like an advanced pay and close, which just means, we this is a predictable illness or injury, and so we're just going to pay you your 6 weeks of disability and close the claim. And so it kind of reduces administrative hassle for both the claimant and the insurer. So I've seen it used, and I've seen talk of it being used for intake, to
Oh,
gather information and sort of triage a claim in the right way. And I think all of those are okay. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for an AI to get smarter around um, recognizing when somebody is ready to start talking about return to work, or to recognize when somebody has a barrier that maybe wouldn't be recognized by a human just having a conversation on the phone. Because there's a lot of that of information that flows in to a disability claim around different comorbid diagnoses, different conversations, different barriers that sometimes don't, just given the nature of the transaction, unfortunately don't have the opportunity to come together. So I do think that from an information dissemination and sort of bringing return to work candidates to the forefront, there's a lot of opportunity there. I just would not want to see the loss of the human touch, because being unable to work is very personal and scary, and there is nuance there. And so as much as again, the industry likes to almost make it transactional through, frankly, in my view, the lack of proper investment in operations, it's not fully transactional, and that's always the rub, is
right.
you need humans to have a conversation and to be compassionate and to build a relationship in order for people to feel safe um, in their recovery and ultimately their return to work.
And I think there is a lot that technology can do for us and AI can do in terms of reducing stress, eh, as you alluded to, assimilating all of the information so you can see when a return to work is more feasible than not. But it's
Hmm.
always important to keep that through line of human connectivity, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as disability and returning to work.
Absolutely.
Um, when you're on disability, and I imagine when you're submitting the paperwork that you talked about, it does seem like a lot of surveillance. How do leaders balance the thought of you're being surveilled often versus trust in the system?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think, there definitely is at times some adversarial feelings around disability. Um, and again, I think that is indicative of a total culture. So in general, I think if a culture tends to be toxic, then there's going to be this mistrust around disability. People saying to HR, "Hey, I saw him on Facebook, and I know, they're supposedly depressed because you shouldn't know that, but everybody talks at work, and they were smiling in a picture, right?" Like, okay, well, depressed people smile sometimes. And so I do think it's indicative of a toxic culture when that happens, and a culture in which, again, there's something driving behavior that is making people potentially use a benefit that was intended for illness, and they're using it maybe to manage their lives and feel empowered to manage their lives. Um, in general, I think, there's a mistrust of insurance companies. And so it can be difficult for a claims manager to build a relationship with a claimant. And there's a skill there. There's a skill set there that claims managers, have to be equipped to build a collaborative relationship, because that is exactly what it is. if it's going to be effective. So there's a fine line. Again, I think there's always a mistrust between insured and insurance company that we're always going to battle. But I think we also have an opportunity to be better, and create a collaborative experience, because it can be a wildly positive experience for folks. Like, I've heard so many great stories of, God, I was at my lowest and my coworkers are really there for me, or my claims manager, I don't know what I would have done without talking to her every week. She was really supportive. Or my vocational consultant that came up with the accommodation that got me back to my life. Like, it really can be a very rewarding experience. It's just about figuring out what's that balance from a business and business perspective.
And I'd like to move on. You mentioned culture driving part of that, and leadership really influences culture to a large degree. When we talked about leadership, we talked about leadership in dog years. What is the real lesson there for women leading teams today?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so I obviously take leadership really seriously as an industrial and organizational psychologist. So any of the teams that I've led, I've tried to instill my footprint around being an empathetic leader. And I think it's incumbent upon leaders in general to know your employees so well that you understand how they best receive feedback, how you're going to create an environment in which they have the best chance for success, the best chance for growth. I think, it's important to have team building in a way that creates camaraderie, that you have task development that creates trust and camaraderie. For me, it's been really rewarding as a leader, to build on my last team was, frankly, I like to say all the time that they were a fairy tale team where we just had this, and at least in my career, an unparalleled sense of team and family almost. And it's funny, like, you see so many memes where they say if your boss tells you you're like, your team's like family, you should not believe them or find another job. But really, I think that there is truly an opportunity to create something that is special, that does move people in a direction that is a shared set of values and mission that do good. And I think we all have that opportunity to support each other in a way that helps us with personal growth, professional growth, but also, again, makes us all feel like what we're doing makes a difference. Um, and so that's hard in and of itself. I think being a woman in leadership, as we talked, I fully believe that if you've been in a woman in leadership for 20 years, I give you times three, right? My dog years theory, which so it feels like 60 years. And I just think that's unfortunate that I think we've come a long, long way, um, but we have a long way to go. Like, I remember my mom, she passed a couple years ago, but when I first started in my career, she was fascinated, and she actually told me to basically attach myself to a man who would pull me up through the ranks, not really
Hmm.
understanding that women at that stage actually had their own independent job title and career, because for her, she was either allowed to be a secretary, a teacher, or a nurse. And my mom, was born in 1937. But, I'm one generation from that. And so we have come a really long way, but at the same time, women are still um, under populated at every level of management in corporate America. We still feel like I actually was just reading a study today, for that book I told you I was writing, about how still women are viewed more harshly in the workplace, and men are still considered natural leaders. And something really interesting that popped up in that article was that we do talk about female leadership,
Hmm.
so we quantify it as female
Yeah.
leadership versus just leader.
Yes, that's
So we're
interesting.
right, right. We're not going to be equal until it's just leadership.
Right.
And so again, I feel like I've done a lot with creating in my microcosm, and I left corporate America and as a VP, but not a senior VP. And so at some point I got to a place where I had to become satisfied with where I was, and I felt like I had this great team that delivered amazing results. Um, but I hit a glass ceiling for sure, and it was exhausting along the way, although rewarding. So I just think that there's so much more that we have, so much more work to be done for our daughters, to feel like they truly do have, they can just be considered leaders versus female leaders.
I agree. I think we could have an entire episode on women
Absolutely.
in leadership or leadership, if you will. You did speak to it shortly, but as you think about your work ahead, what excites you most about your next chapter?
Love the consulting world in what I'm doing now in Tugman Consulting because I get to do the work that I want to do, the work that I think is most impactful. Work with the organizations that want to do this good work, that want to continue to create environments that propel the the health and the wealth and the well-being of their employees. That ultimately is going to have significant impact to their bottom line. I'm excited to I just started, writing a book proposal. I'm super excited about that because I think my story is a little bit different around I'm not a CEO. I mean, I'm a CEO in my own tiny organization, but I'm not coming at it from as a woman that made it all the way to the CEO ship. I'm a woman that worked in leadership for 20 years, and I have a tale to tell around lessons learned and struggles and accomplishments and legacy that um, I think it could use some work in terms of how do you leave behind that high performing team intact as you as a leader step away. I think that there's something to be said for how that does or doesn't happen. And so I'm excited to share my story, and I hope it helps others feel at least empowered or not alone in the effort.
And I'm for one excited to read your story when it does come out. I think it'll be a wonderful book, and I hope our listeners look out for it as well. I think this has been such a thoughtful conversation and really given us a lot of insights into disability in the workplace and a a broader perspective of what it really means, that it's not just a line item, and what it really means to be in that middle bucket and how employers can have a return in ROI, which you don't often think about when it comes to disability. For those listening, we'll link Kristin's work in the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening to the Madison Advisory AI podcast. We will see you next time.